This is to be treasured. Thank you, Kate, immensely. I was slightly discombobulated approaching the platform and looking down at the yawning chasm below. Just last week, I was speaking at the Palais de Congrès in Montreal, and it brought back memories of having spoken there some 25 years earlier, when during the course of my remarks, they turned out all of the lights in the auditorium, and I decided to leave. And I approached what I thought were the stairs leading down from the platform, but of course there were no stairs at all, and I fell 6 feet to a concrete floor and broke my hip. So I am perilously close to the edge and feeling profoundly anxious. Mind you, at the time it occurred, it did allow Brian Mulroney to say to the media that he wasn't at all surprised because Stephen Lewis had been walking into space all his adult life. I'm profoundly pleased to be here, and I want you to let the milk of human kindness flow through your veins. I'm struggling a little with a minor physical matter, and I'm not going to speak in an expatiating way for a great length of time. I'm going to try to encapsulate some ideas at the outset about the end of AIDS, and then engage in a conversation with André. I must say, to have André Picard on the platform is a particular privilege and joy. And then we can, I hope, have questions and answers which will be more illuminating than the comments I make at the outset. I am surrounded by friends, not only Kate, who made such a lovely introduction, but one of my colleagues at AIDS Free World, who is a lawyer on our staff dealing with communities so often in Africa. Seth Earn is sitting here in the front row, so I am emboldened to take positions which may be regarded as controversial or unacceptable, knowing that I have people who will rationalize my otherwise indefensible positions. The broad ambit of end of AIDS reality or hyperbole seems to me might begin roughly this way. Since the beginning of the pandemic, 40 million people have died. 35 million are now living with the virus. 14 million of them roughly are in treatment, leaving obviously 21, 22 million who require treatment in order to stay alive. It is the assumption and the objective of UNAIDS and the World Health Organization to achieve what they call the end of AIDS by the year 2030. And it is a position which has borrowed strongly from Julio Montaner's treatment as prevention. That little anecdote which Kate shared with you was in fact true, and it had an aftermath which I often look back at in a curious way. I sat with Julio at a press conference at that International AIDS Conference in Toronto in 2006, when he divulged his theory to the media and the scientists who were in the room. And there was a great deal of skepticism. But I was quite and totally taken and converted by what seemed to me the simple and irreversible logic of what Julio was saying. And I think it's quite a testament that at this point in time, so many years later, the world broadly has adopted what many are calling test and treat, but which is originally known as treatment as prevention. Now, I think it is fair to say that in a sort of arithmetic model, it is legitimate to look to 2030 as the end of AIDS if you assume that millions upon millions of people will be in treatment for HIV, and because they are in treatment, their viral load will drop to undetectable levels, so that if they then engage in unprotected sex, the virus will not be transmitted. So you'll have a situation in the eyes of UNAIDS in 2030 where very large numbers of people, in the millions, will be on treatment for a lifetime, but the HIV which they carry will never actually convert into AIDS, although there will certainly be people who are living with AIDS, but there will be no further cases, to put it at its best, and therefore we will see the end of AIDS in that fashion, narrowly defined. As André Bicard showed in a fascinating piece that he wrote subsequent to the International AIDS Conference in Melbourne, UNAIDS has taken as a new mantra a formula called 90-90-90. 90% by 2020 of those people who are infected will know they are infected. 90% by 2020 who require treatment will be in treatment, and 90% by 2020 whose viral load will be suppressed. And if all of that comes together, as eagerly and urgently the protagonists of the formula will pursue, then come 2030, they will call it the end of AIDS. I don't believe that. I don't doubt for a moment that the arithmetic calculation could be real, but it has always seemed to me that putting millions upon millions of people in treatment between now and 2030, some 22 or 23 million more, taking into account the need for adherence, taking into account the side effects, taking into account the drug stockouts, taking into account all of the groups that are struggling on the ground still, I think it will be very difficult to have a definitive end in 2030, and I'm joined in that skeptical view by my colleagues in the organization AIDS Free World. And there are a number of areas, if I may just quickly adumbrate, that I think give some substance to that theory. Number one, and Kate has already mentioned it, is that the virus has a woman's face. And the degree of oppression of women, the degree of misogyny, the absence of gender equality, the struggle that women have to be taken seriously around the pandemic will make it extremely difficult to pull off the best of intentions by the year 2030. I remind you that of all the infections in Africa, some 25 million, 58% are women and girls. In the age group 15 to 24, those who are infected, 60% are women and girls. Women and girls are infected roughly 5 to 7 years earlier than men in the same broad category. Women and girls are at monumentally higher risk. And almost from the beginning of the pandemic to today, we've never been able to get the world, and certainly the United Nations agencies, to take seriously the reality of women's vulnerability in the face of the pandemic. And all of the excruciating circumstances, in particular, for example, sexual violence, which so often transmits the virus, put women at ever greater risk. And there is a sensibility growing that around adolescents in particular, those between 15 and 19, those then between 15 and 24, the disproportionate number of young women who are affected is an absolute nightmare. And despite all the sonorous and sometimes fatuous banalities that litter the pages of the reports from UNAIDS and UNICEF, we simply aren't getting the sense that we have to turn things around for the adolescent age group. We're getting the generalities, we're not getting the substance. There is a report about to emerge from UNICEF. I guess I am constrained from dealing with the particulars because it hasn't been tabled yet, but it largely deals with this array of adolescents from age 10 to 19 is what they call it. And in the course of the document, they make the point that because of the focus on infants and children, there has never been an organization that could handle the mandate and the commitment around adolescence. And I remember reading it and thinking to myself, wait a minute, there's something called the Convention on the Rights of the Child. A child is defined as every human being under the age of 18 in Article 1 of the Convention. The organization that is charged with the mandate under the Convention on the Rights of the Child is UNICEF. How do you say that there is no organization capable of handling adolescence when you are given that precise obligation by an international convention which has been ratified by virtually every single country in the world? And what one sees in that phenomenon is the tendency amongst multilateral agencies to spend all of their time pointing fingers at others, but never taking responsibility themselves. I'm inching into my dotage. As a matter of fact, I'm well past my dotage. As you can see, coherence is a struggle for me. And I must say that I'm increasingly agitated at the way in which these UN agencies, which have primary purview over the way in which governments respond to the virus, the way in which they avoid responsibility. I would suspect that people in this audience don't know the power of UN entities and agencies. It's really extraordinary. They have staff on the ground. They have full-time representatives on the ground. They have a great deal of money, sometimes, as in the case of a UNICEF or a UNDP, billions of dollars a year. They have contracts with the governments where they are situate. They are able to influence government as almost no other independent group. It's just astonishing. And yet there is a sense that somehow their job is to chronicle the faults and foibles of the world rather than to take the leadership position which would lead us out of the morass. But it's not just the women. It's many other factors. Before I get to those other factors, let me mention one other matter related to women and AIDS, which again has been so perplexing for my colleagues and myself. There is an organization called UN Women. It's the first new international agency for women, the first new international agency in many respects since the United Nations was formed 60 years ago. It was more than 60 years ago. It is an agency that emerged just 2 or 3 years ago after a tremendous internal battle to make the United Nations recognize that they had failed when it comes to gender. So we have a new international agency for women. It could be making a tremendous difference on the ground in HIV, but it's being starved by the very countries that agreed to establish it. The industrial nations are simply not funding UN Women in a way that would allow it to do its work. It's heartbreaking. You fight like hell over a prolonged period of time to get an agency created, and then the very countries that said they would back it are demonstrably betraying or sabotaging the commitment. UN Women now has maybe $300 or $400 million a year. UNICEF, an agency for children, has $4 to $5 billion. UNDP, even more than that. Why is it that women are always made to occupy the bottom rung of social, economic, cultural, and political priorities? Now, beyond the women in questioning whether or not we can make it in 2030, as some would wish, is the question of children. We have 3.2 million children living with the virus in this world. Only 24% of them are in treatment. A quarter of them in treatment. How are we going to move the needle of success through to 100% or even 90% by the year 2030? I think it's going to be an excruciatingly difficult target to achieve. And there were 240,000 new infants born HIV positive in 2013. These are huge undertakings yet to be achieved. There are all the high-risk groups, as they are called. The sex workers, the gay men and other men who have sex with men, injecting drug users, transgendered populations, prison populations. They're subject to such intense discrimination, stigma, isolation, marginalization. There are 78 countries in this world that criminalize homosexuality, 7 countries in this world that provide the death penalty for homosexuality. There are some 13 million injecting drug users in the world, of whom 1.7 million are HIV positive. How do we move things with sufficient urgency and force between now and 2030 to achieve the target, which is allegedly to be embraced by all? The most recent UNAIDS report is called the GAP report, in which they narratively itemize the numbers who are left behind. And they named many groups that are left behind, from the high-risk groups through to adolescents, through to pregnant women, through to people with disabilities. But there's one group completely missing. You don't hear the name. And that's orphans. There are 17 million orphans, kids who have lost one or both parents to AIDS. When you're talking about ending the pandemic, you can't merely measure it, I think, although it is one measure, in terms of the drugs you get out and the commodities you purchase and the arithmetic and statistical compilations which you put in place. But it has to be measured in terms of the intensely human dimension. What's happened to these orphan kids? There was a time just a few years ago where they were on the front page of every UNICEF report because they were such great fundraising vehicles. And not so long ago, when we talked about child-headed households, little kids who'd lost their parents to AIDS, looking after their younger siblings, everybody talked of orphans. But now, orphans are gone. It's as though they don't exist. They're not in the reports. What happened? You see, what happened, I think, is that they don't need the drugs in the same numbers. They're not part of the algebraic calculus which has been so intrinsic to the way in which we now look at AIDS, all the statistical tables, all of the numbers. But the human dimension is not as significantly embraced. And by the way, these are not little kids anymore. When I go out to a country, into the rural area, and people say to me, "Stephen, we'd like you to meet some orphans," and I say, "Sure, I'd appreciate that." Out come the orphans in their 20s, trailing their own children behind them, with absolutely no experience in parenting whatsoever. These are social dynamics of an entire society. You can't exclude them from the calculus of the end of AIDS. The end of AIDS isn't merely getting the drugs to people who need it, although that is absolutely vital because it will keep them alive and presumably stop the explosion of new infection. But it also deals with a dismembered society and the consequences for individuals in that society. It was felt, I think, for a considerable period of time, that if you made cash transfers to orphan families, that would be sufficient to allow them to function, to go to school, to have health care, to have food, to have a house to live in or a home to live in, and therefore you didn't have to dwell on orphans. But as good as the cash transfers are, they are microscopic in some communities and they're not sufficient. Oh, well, some people said, we've got to have OVCs, orphans and vulnerable children, because you shouldn't single out orphans alone. What about all those other impoverished children who are also deserving of the state's intervention? But then they learned over time that there was something special and qualitatively different about orphans because of the horrendous way in which they had become orphans, and therefore had to be dealt with differently. I've never understood, my colleagues and I have never understood what has happened to that huge orphan population. I can remember visiting Uganda with Graça Machel, that magnificent woman who was the former Minister of Education in Mozambique and a former First Lady of Mozambique and married to Nelson Mandela and is now moving around the world pursuing women's and children's issues. And we were in Uganda together, and we were sitting down, it was at midnight, with President Museveni of Uganda, talking about the rising rates of HIV, which people were traumatized by because Uganda had been a model of decline in infection. And Museveni suddenly interrupted the conversation and said, positively quivering with intensity, "I've got 2 million orphans in Uganda, Graça. How do I handle them? Where do I get the funding? How do I keep them going? Who looks after them when the extended families are frayed?" And I'll never forget that conversation because it was clearly a focus which we had insufficiently observed. And then, of course, there's the whole panoply of social and reproductive health and family planning, an entire dimension of the lives of women and girls to which the world has paid virtually no heed. When the Millennium Development Goals were first propounded in the year 2000, 8 goals attempting to energize the entire world to overcome the grotesque disparities between the North and the South, there wasn't a word about sexual and reproductive health. Nobody included it in the goals. It had to come in by the back door several years later. Well, now, presumably, when the next set of Sustainable Development Goals comes into play, we'll be able to handle it, sexual and reproductive health, but it's tremendously important. And the absence of family planning for so many women on a continent like Africa, the continent I know best, forgive me for dwelling on it, the absence of family planning prejudices and compromises the lives of women and makes them ever more vulnerable. And I think of education. I think of the excruciating fact that only 26% of all adolescents in Africa are said to have accurate and comprehensive information about HIV. How do young girls protect themselves in the midst of a cauldron of infection if they don't understand how the infection is spread? 80% of the girls don't enter secondary school. A third of them are unable to read. All of these factors have to come together if you're going to speak about the end of AIDS. You can't deal with it in merely one component. One has to recognize that it is a vast, complex network of human interactions which will make all the difference. And then, of course, there's the funding. The funding is a matter of enormous concern. Last year, we spent, through indigenous monies and external monies, something like $19.1 billion on HIV and AIDS. UNAIDS projects that we need $24 billion. How do we find the shortfall? PEPFAR, the presidential initiative out of the United States, has reduced its funding. It's causing tremendous anxiety, not to say incipient panic, in a number of countries who have relied on PEPFAR. The Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria was $3 billion short in their last replenishment conference. Where is the additional funding going to come? And now, perfectly understandably, the non-communicable diseases, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular, you name it, they're now working hard for a share of the pie. They are deeply resentful at the way in which HIV and AIDS seems to have appropriated the international dollars, and not only HIV and AIDS, but malaria and tuberculosis as well. So you have this sad but earnest competition amongst diseases for the money that's available because the pie is not enlarging. All of this suggests a tremendous tussle over the next 15 years before 2030. All of us desperately want to see the virus confounded and the pandemic brought to an end. But it is so important, it seems to me, that when you talk of the end of AIDS, to notice the lacerated society. Look at what Ebola is doing to Liberia. To recognize the human relationships that are dismembered. To witness a generation torn from the fabric of a country. The memories of pain and death, which are never ending. How the present has been compromised by the past. We're talking about a positive amalgam of factors, all of which have to be addressed simultaneously. The AIDS pandemic is not over. There is, in the mind of my colleagues and myself, a certain irresponsibility to talk with such facile constancy about an AIDS-free generation. It hasn't even come close as yet. There are huge numbers of factors at play. There's so much struggle still at the grassroots. My God, I look at my foundation in Canada. I have very, very little to do with it. I chair the board, but the board is a quintessential rubber stamp, and all of the work is done by the staff, thank God. And I look at the Grandmothers Campaign, and I think of how these grandmothers are sustaining whole societies, whole communities, whole countries. And they're sustaining them not only dealing with the orphan kids, but dealing with all of the features of life. And they're struggling. They've moved now into a new part of the struggle, a struggle for human rights and human dignity, and that's magnificent. But at root, there's still a sense that it isn't over. People are dying. There's not enough funding. Little kids are still infected. There's a lot of anguish. There is intense agony in families. And therefore, the hospitable but facile phrases of the end of AIDS are more hyperbolic than they are realistic. And all of us who care about this issue, and all of you who have worked so hard, because I'm sure there are grandmothers festooning this auditorium. I always have to acknowledge as the grandmothers, or my life is not worth living. I don't doubt that all of you who have been so magnificently engaged in this struggle understand that we're talking about the human fabric. We're talking about human sensibilities. We're talking about a recognition that you can't forever spend your money fighting wars and giving and providing corporate bailouts and dealing with banks. You have to recognize that the more honorable struggle that lies at the heart of the human condition is a struggle that never forgets the frailty and the resilience, the anxiety and the strength, the tremendous courage, sophistication, generosity of spirit that lies at the grassroots of country after country, especially amongst the women. And until their lives are irrevocably secured, AIDS is not over. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. I've had the pleasure of hearing you many, many times, and it's always so moving and so informative. And what we want to do now is have a little conversation. I'll talk a little bit to you, and then I'll bring in the audience questions. I have my little Twitter feed going, and then we'll have some live questions to be old-fashioned.
I don't know what Twitter is, so that's
We'll teach you. We'll teach you. So you talked a lot about the future and the present. I want to take you to the past a bit. People are interested in knowing how did you get so interested and so passionate about this issue? When did it all begin? Was there an epiphany? Was there something?
I was saying at a lovely little lunch that the Wall Centre held today that I had been working at UNICEF between 1995 and 99 as the Deputy Executive Director in charge of international programming. And because of that privileged position, I was able to watch what we were doing in the various countries. And in Africa, all of our most intense campaigns, particularly around immunization, seemed to be thwarted by the virus. Every time we thought we were making progress, we were losing children as a result of HIV and conversion into AIDS. And I felt in 1999 that I should leave UNICEF and devote myself to HIV because that's where the vulnerability was greatest. So I did. I started working for Peter Piot, who was then the executive director of UNAIDS, and then I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to be the envoy under Kofi Annan and to tramp around the African countries. And I guess, Andre, I guess I was overwhelmed by what I saw between 2001 and 2006. I couldn't handle it. I had worked for a couple of years as a member of a panel investigating the Rwandan genocide, and that was pretty awful. But I had never seen anything like the carnage of AIDS. I was just absolutely transfixed by it. And you can't work in country after country, which strikes you as a graveyard, without feeling that you want to do something about it and become passionate about it. And particularly when you get situations like South Africa, where you had a president, Thabo Mbeki, and an ambulatory lunatic minister of health who believed that sweet potatoes and garlic would solve the problem of HIV. And as a result, well, literally hundreds of thousands of people were dying unnecessarily because Thabo Mbeki. One of my singular hopes in life is to take Thabo Mbeki before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, along with George Bush and Tony Blair, just to make it equal.
That's quite the trio.
Yeah.
Now, remind the folks, I told you about Twitter, that the Twitter hashtag to ask questions is hashtag WallX. And if you don't know what that means, you're not on Twitter. So you've seen so much, and you talked about those early days, but how does it not become overwhelming? How do you still remain hopeful?
You know, that's an easier question to answer. It doesn't become overwhelming because of the strength of the women on the ground. I'm sorry to reduce it to such a simple-minded way of putting it, but you cannot travel in Africa without recognizing the enormous intelligence and sophistication of the women and the way in which they mobilize whole communities and support each other and do home-based care and to look after each other. It's a phenomenon to observe. It is more intense, I think, than most societies, certainly North American societies, and it is really admirable and tremendous to deal with. And that gives me hope. It's always given me hope. I've seen it everywhere I've gone. It is ever thus. So for me, it's the women. Now, I was very lucky. We created a foundation, and Canadians have been incredibly generous, and so the foundation has been able to do very strong work on the ground with these selfsame women. And that, too, has been a sustaining feature, obviously. But the women, it's the women of Africa. Damn it all. If the world could turn its power and its governance to the women of Africa, we wouldn't have an ISIL and drones being used and all the other apparatus of war.
But you have this continent of women who are being infected with
Yes.
AIDS because it's a disease of inequality.
Yes, and because women can't say no to sex, because women can't say wear a condom, because women are so vulnerable to rape and sexual violence, there is this terrible disparity. They are immensely vulnerable. In societies like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it is a nightmare. In societies like South Africa, where it isn't rape and conflict, it's intimate partner rape, it's marital rape, it's gang rape. It's a terrible situation, but through it all, there is this extraordinary strength.
And how do you change that? You don't change that with antiretrovirals.
No, you don't. Thank you, you don't. That's the point, I think, that has to be made. You've got to change that through tremendous shifts in the way society is governed and the way in which women are made to feel protected and not so vulnerable. It's so fascinating and in many ways soul-destroying that most of the money that is going to sexual violence internationally is going to solve the pain after the rape has occurred. The money goes to the women after the sexual violence has happened. There's almost no money going to prevention of sexual violence. There are a number of small groups, we're one of them, working very hard on approaches to ending sexual violence. And I think that out of the big conference on sexual violence and conflict that was held by William Hague and Angelina Jolie in London last June, and out of the extraordinary work which is being done by V-Day and all of its supporters around the world, and the little NGOs like our own, where we focus so strongly on ending sexual violence in a variety of fashions, that will gradually make an impact. But it shouldn't be always the responsibility of the women. You know, this business of you've got to empower the women to resist sexual violence. Well, my co-director of AIDS Free World, a woman named Paula Donovan, was saying to me the other day on the phone, think of that young woman on the bus in New Delhi in December of 2012, 13. She was empowered. She was a student. She was studying. She was going to be a professional. She had a very significant sense of self-worth and capacity. And look what happened to her. You've just got to change the society. You can't constantly say to the women, it's your responsibility to emancipate yourselves. It's a mistake.
So in short, men have to be responsible.
Yes, but men by and large are beyond redemption. So it makes it very tough to rely on men. Of course, men have to be involved, but they have shown themselves peculiarly indifferent to getting involved. There are pockets of passionate involvement, but they're only pockets. I think it's a matter of changing societal structures, that understanding the way in which the society operates is so antithetic to what we really want. May I invoke an analogy? Naomi Klein's new book, This Changes Everything, makes the very powerful point that you can't change the consequences of global warming by using better light bulbs or taking public transit or shorter showers or even using the oil sands in a more incremental way. You've got to change capitalism. You've got to fight the economic and social construct if you want to change it. And I think around sexual violence, the societal changes have to be very profound. There will be women who lead it, no question, but the society as a whole has to change.
Where is this happening? Are there little pockets that give you hope?
Yeah. I'm fascinated by something called the City of Joy in Bukavu in the eastern region of the Congo, where Eve Ensler and V-Day have established a remarkable habitat where modest numbers of women, between 70 and 90 at a time for 6 months period, all of whom have been raped, come together for training and employment eventually, and a lot of psychotherapy and a lot of sense of overcoming the horror which was visited on them. It's overseen to some extent by the Pansy Hospital, which is run by this astonishing doctor named Dr. Denis Mukwege, who provides support for the women. I went to the opening of the City of Joy. I was saying earlier that there were some 2,000 women assembled, each and every one of whom had been brutally raped by the wandering militias of the Congo. And yet there they were, dancing and singing and tremendously resilient and determined to overcome it. So I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by the efforts being made in Botswana around integrating men and women using HIV as the catalyst. They're making some very real progress. I'm interested in the community conversations which are taking place between older men and younger women in Ethiopia, which seem to hold a real prospect for change. I think some of the things that are happening in the United States, both in the military and in places like Steubenville, are gradually, the prognosis is hopeful. It would be nice if we could get an inquiry into the missing and murdered Aboriginal women of Canada, and you know, enlarge the sensibilities of Canadians in the process. But this is a very slow. Can I take 1 minute longer? Absolutely. I am. So many of us. The Stephen Lewis Foundation and AIDS-Free World are both intensely feminist organizations. Everything is driven by a feminist sensibility. And in the foundation, there is more and more focus on that in the work that is done at the grassroots. In AIDS-Free World, we're doing three things, which are characteristic of how you want to deal with sexual violence. In 2008, we were approached by a group from the Girl Child Network in Zimbabwe, telling us that Robert Mugabe, with his war veterans and his youth corps, were regularly raping women solely and exclusively because they supported the opposition party. And they asked us to help. And we took a large number of affidavits, over 70 affidavits, in order to compile a dossier which we could take before the South African Police Service and the National Prosecuting Authority and ask for an investigation under the rubric of universal jurisdiction, because South Africa has domesticated the International Criminal Court statute and can, if we get an appropriate ruling from one of the high courts, allow the investigation to take place. Seth Earn, whom I referred to before, Seth has been laterally overseeing all of that within South Africa, and we're waiting for a decision from the Constitutional Court, the highest court in South Africa, to see whether we can launch that investigation. The women say their lives have been destroyed, but they want justice, and we're determined to see that justice is given. Then Paula Donovan, to whom I made reference, has been pressing us hard on a design which she calls No Rape, KNOW, where using a handheld device that handles open-ended questions in the language of the person being interviewed. It can be done in rural areas, it can be done in private, there's no intimidation or prejudice associated with it, and the effort is to identify those obstructions which stand in the way of reporting of rape, because the process of reporting is always such a tiny percentage of the rapes that occur. And if we can remove the obstacles and get the reporting more fully in play and make the communities understand their responsibility for the culture, then maybe we can get some of the perpetrators before justice. We've been testing it in South Africa, in Khayelitsha, the slum outside Cape Town, and in Limpopo, a rural area, in order to give a difference. And we're pretty excited. We won a Grand Challenge Award from Canada, and we'll be reporting on it fully by the end of this month. And we think we have found a handheld device which we developed ourselves in conjunction with a particular technology firm in Cape Town. I think we're onto something. And then finally, because this is a this is a preoccupation with us, and I'm proud to be associated with it. I don't drive it. There are others who drive it much more effectively. We, in looking at sexual violence in conflict, we recognized, again, it was Paula who recognized that, incredibly enough, this is the ultimate irony, the one group in the world that is immune from prosecution for sexual violence and sexual trafficking is, or are, United Nations peacekeepers. They have immunity, which is conferred by the Convention on Privileges and Immunities that dates back to 1946, by the Special Forces agreements which are arranged with the troop contributing countries, by the memorandums of understanding arranged with the host countries. And the way it works is that if someone from Bangladesh or Uruguay or Pakistan or Senegal is accused of sexual violence or sexual trafficking, as unfortunately happens with some regularity within UN peacekeeping forces and police forces and civilian personnel, then they can hide behind impunity and they never get prosecuted. And it's really ghastly. It's just unacceptable. If you want to see a really good film, and the woman on whose life the film was based is coming to a workshop on the question of immunity we're holding in Montreal in 2 weeks' time. Her name is Kathy Bolkovic. If you haven't seen the film The Whistleblower, draw it up on iTunes and watch it. It's an amazing film, and it tells the story vividly of the immunity and impunity of United Nations peacekeepers. So that's what we do.
So a lot of really good questions coming in on Twitter, so I'm going to grab some for you.
God.
You don't have to look. I'll read them for you.
But I hate it because I'm out there I was making a speech in Vancouver to Unifor, the union, last Saturday, and I was saying things about Stephen Harper which actually weren't very nice. They were well. I'm not seeking or eliciting applause, although it's very, very nice to hear you do it. I used a choice of words on occasion which might not be seen as felicitous. And sure enough, there they are on Twitter. How the hell am I supposed to know who's sending stuff out?
There you go. Well, this audience is sending some great questions, so we'll read those. One that's coming up repeatedly, you've got the audience fired up. They want to know, what can they do when they go home? What's the thing an average Canadian can do to address these issues you're raising?
Well, I would think that associating with charitable groups, mostly charitable groups, who work on issues involving marginalized groups is a hell of a good thing to do, whether it's a shelter for HIV, whether it's a homeless crusade, whether it's a food bank, whether it's a social welfare vehicle. All of these things can be turned into a very positive contribution to the community as a whole. I think it's tremendously useful to become engaged concretely in some of these issues. One of the people in the audience tonight is Patsy George. Patsy will be known to many of you, and Patsy is the sort of the iconic figure who is involved in every single one of these activities. I've learned a lot from Patsy other than driving a car, and I must say that it's interesting how, if you immerse yourself in some charitable organization, and there are big ones, Save the Children, CARE, UNICEF, Oxfam, many of the environmental organizations, many of the human rights organizations, but that's what I would do. I would not leave it as an abstraction. I would identify with an organization and get involved.
And let's not forget AIDS-Free World in the list.
Well, AIDS-Free World would love it if you corresponded with us, but we don't have a lot of capacity to respond to every single intervention.
Okay. So another question that's come up a few times, how's Canada doing? What's Canada doing in this fight against AIDS? Are we doing enough?
No. We have given a modest amount of money, which increased modestly, to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Interestingly enough, it was Paul Martin who made the most substantial contribution. Back in 2003, when the World Health Organization propounded its premise of 3 by 5 to put 3 million people into treatment by the year 2005, the World Health Organization required $100 million to put experts in all of the country offices to see that this happened. And Paul Martin gave the money. It was just an extraordinary moment of humanitarian intervention on the part of Canada. But Canada can't be making a major contribution because we have cut off our foreign aid. We have put a ceiling on our foreign aid. There hasn't been any additional foreign aid for 3 to 4 years. We are now down to approximately 0.27% of gross national product of the 24 or 25 countries in the OECD Index of Development Assistance Committees. Canada standing 3rd or 4th from the bottom now. I mean, it's just a travesty how little we are contributing to international humanitarian aid, except for this big idea of maternal and child health, but no one seems to be able to track the money, so I'm not sure exactly what's happening with that. But the fact that we have essentially sabotaged CEDA by merging it with foreign affairs, and we have put a cap on the money we will give to CEDA. The Gates Foundation gives out more money than the Canadian government. We have caused ourselves impossible difficulties in making adequate contributions to these causes.
And I can't avoid noting that our maternal and family health support excludes contraception, abortion, reproductive health, etc.
Well, that's interesting. It doesn't quite exclude contraception because of Hillary Clinton badgering Stephen Harper. So even though he didn't like it and the Tory caucus didn't like it, there is some possibility of contraceptive inclusion, but abortion, God forbid. And of course, abortion is a really serious issue in the developing world. The tremendous numbers of forced abortions and of illegal abortions, and the numbers of women who die as a result of illegal abortion is heartbreaking. And to have a government that engages in maternal and child care and refuses to deal with it is really ugly, absolutely ugly. I'm being terribly restrained and well-behaved.
Well, that's because, you know, some people are tweeting.
Yeah.
So. Now let's go to a live question. I see someone at the mic over here. Go ahead. They'll just turn on the mic. It'll take a second.
Well, look at that. You are illuminated.
Hello? Is it on?
Yes.
Yes? Thank you. I'm Marcia Brondy, and I live in the Kootenays of British Columbia. In Nelson, we have the Grands to Grands, and in the Slocan Valley, where I live, we have the Grassroots Grandmas. Both organizations have been raising money for the Stephen Lewis Foundation and their work in Africa for a long time. I'm just wondering whether this event has been videotaped, and is there a way to bring your remarks back to them?
I don't know. I'm kind of shy, so I don't like video. But I genuinely don't know whether it's been videotaped.
I can answer that. It is being videotaped, and it's going to be posted on the Wall Center webpage in the next. They just have to fix it up a bit. They have to do my makeup, and then they'll be able to post it.
Well, thank you very much.
I was concerned that Andre was tieless. Let me mention to you that the foundation has the film, the documentary film, I think it's 45 minutes in length, on the tribunal, which was held here in Vancouver. The film is astonishing. We are being pressed very hard to take it to Sundance and a number of international film festivals around the world. It will completely re-energize the grandmothers' movement if they need another jolt of energy.
Always.
But it's a magnificent piece of work because the African grandmothers who speak about human rights, who have taken their struggle to another dimension. It is no longer survival, but it's an assertion of rights and of dignity. And whether it's land rights or particular rights around education or health, it's spectacular. And then you've got Theo Soa, who heads the Africa Women's Development Forum. You have Joy Pumapi, who was a former Minister of Health of Botswana. You have Gloria Steinem, who is known to everyone. All of these women were judges listening to the testimony of the grandmothers. It's been put together in a remarkable piece of work. It's been asked, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria has asked to have it shown at their next board meeting, which is unprecedented because they regard Stephen Lewis as subversive. So it's extremely nice of them to do this. I urge you to tell the Kootenays and Nelson and everyone else that I do know that Nelson is a place, that the film on the Grandmothers Tribunal is frankly, it's almost a work of art.
And available from?
And available from Stephen Lewis Foundation in Toronto. They're going to send it out to absolutely everyone.
Great.
Viewing will be mandatory.
My heart to you. Thank you for everything you do.
It was a nice hug. Thank you.
And I want to ask you about, you mentioned Nelson, but let's look a little further to Prince George. I remember we were in Prince George together and you spoke about AIDS in the Aboriginal community. Yeah. Say a few words about, that's almost Canada's Africa, if you will.
Yeah, it is. And the levels of infection in the Aboriginal community are very high. Obviously, in places like Prince George and in some of the communities in the Yukon, I know, and obviously in the downtown east side in Vancouver. That's one of the reasons I have such a tremendous regard for the BC Centre of Excellence and the work that Kate and others and Julio do with marginalized groups around HIV, which is so desperately needed. And by the way, has built this extraordinary cachet, reputation around the country. I mean, nobody is doing as well as British Columbia is doing, and other provinces are recognizing that. I think it's because of Kathleen Wynne, who I think is a very good Premier of Ontario. There is a strong sensibility about these issues emerging in Ontario, and I think that what's going on in the Aboriginal community, the struggles around Idle No More, the emergence of a new head chief of the AFN, the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, the dreadfully inadequate follow-up to the residential schools, what has been elicited by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all of these things coming together are putting a spotlight on the vulnerability of Aboriginal, of First Nations persons, and certainly around AIDS. That's real.
So let's go over here for a question. Go ahead.
My name is Andre Bamforth. I'm a health professional. I work here in HIV locally in Vancouver and also in Africa, where I volunteer my time 2 months a year. And I thank you very much, Stephen Lewis, to bring these issues of HIV to the forefront. And as just now you were talking about the issues of HIV in Canada, and I'm so upset that our healthcare system is not federally more concentrating on this issue and going through all the provinces, because even though the program of prevention as treatment is ignored by the rest of the provinces of Canada, yet is bought in by the Netherlands, France, Kenya, US, Brazil, but not with the whole of Canada. And I'm really upset about this, and I would like to really get everybody, every Canadian citizens, Aboriginal or not. If you're Canadian, then we should be looking after each other, continue to care about each other, and bring this issue forward, and partake into the eradication of HIV. And I agree with you, 2030 is an impossibility. I don't know if I'll be alive then, but I certainly will continue to work until my last breath.
Where do you volunteer in Africa?
Kenya recently, I was there in April, and otherwise I'm in Ghana and Burkina Faso by the Mali border with the nomad tribes.
Well, thank you for what you do. It's it's hugely important.
I love
no,
it.
I don't want to diminish it. The role that Canadians play, just out of simple, fierce commitment to the human condition, to improving the human condition. This is important. It is odd in Canada when we have somebody like Julio and a number of others, for instance, in Montreal, who have played such a role in the whole question of HIV, that the country as a whole hasn't embraced test and treat. But on the other hand, you know, you're pushing me. You don't have at the federal government level either the interest or the intelligence to deal with the issue. So you keep fighting, but don't have lavish expectations.
And you know that in Saskatchewan we have a huge problem, which is identical numbers as
I agree.
Africa. And yet it's very near British Columbia. Saskatchewan is not very far.
Yeah,
and the same stats.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree. Okay. But it has a government which is not deeply concerned with the issue.
How can we mobilize?
We'll just send a circular to all of the homes in Saskatchewan telling them they were wrong to defeat the NDP.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you. So let me ask you another Twitter question. You talked about the role of UN agencies, of a lot of these groups. Someone's asking, how do you get the balance right between the role of these groups and ownership of programs in countries on the ground?
Interesting. I think the ownership is absolute. You can't run these programs without the countries feeling ownership. But on the other hand, the capacity of the UN agencies to work with the countries and to give them the sense of ownership is fundamental, and it's not often employed. And I've watched it. It's one of the few things I can speak on with authority. I can speak with authority about political defeat. My own political career was one of transcendental futility. So I'm an expert in that area. But I can also speak with some authority about how these UN agencies work, because I've watched it. I've watched, for example, a UNICEF when it was headed by someone in New York, a Jim Grant, who instructed his representatives on the ground what to do, how to implement policies, why growth monitoring, oral rehydration therapy, breastfeeding, and immunization were the 4 key ingredients for salvation for kids in certain countries, and he never pulled back from pursuing that agenda. And then you have another head of UNICEF who is largely uninterested in those issues, and nothing happens on the ground. Then you have another head of UNICEF who spent her entire first year trying to make sure that one of the elevators was reserved for her use at all times. So, these are eccentricities which you have to deal with. But I must say that the rhetoric has to be met by the work on the ground. For example, not only did Uganda pass a discriminatory law against homosexuals, but it very recently passed an awful law on HIV, where there's mandatory testing imposed on pregnant women, on those who are subject to sexual violence. I mean, it's a pretty awful law. Not a bloody peep from the UN agencies, who are in principle responsible for and care about violations of human rights. And throughout our entire battle around the anti-gay law in Uganda, there was not a peep from the UNAIDS representative through the months and months of battle. So all of this rhetorical flim-flam has to be expressed on the ground if the country is going to feel a sense of ownership, because they're supported. In fact, my colleagues and I had to remove the most recent envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa because she was involved in a complete conflict of interest. And again, there is such a disconnect. So no one should believe that the UN is in any way impotent. The UN has enormous power on the ground. The agencies are the exemplars of multilateralism. They're 1,000 times more worthy than the nonsense that goes on at the Security Council, where every paralytic veto confounds what you do in Syria, Libya, or anywhere else. The agencies can get it done, and the inability to provide the leadership is simply unacceptable. Sorry, go ahead.
So go ahead.
Hi, my name's Tom Sanborn. I'm a freelance writer and organizer here in town. I wanted to thank you for your work and your witness. It's wonderful to have you back amongst us, despite the fact that most of the people in this room are going to walk out more brokenhearted and more sure that we're not doing enough because of your goddamn witness. Thanks a lot, Stephen. We're all going to have to work harder.
I love that you're swearing.
My grandkids love it too.
Okay.
It was bracing to hear the words misogyny, AIDS, and capitalism all in the same paragraph. I think this reflects some of the profound learning that you, like a few other lucky people, have had at the hands of radical feminists over the last 30 years. They are related machines of evil. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask you for your thoughts about the impact that female genital mutilation has had on the AIDS epidemic, and the impact that profit-driven pharmaceutical industries have had on the failure to get the drugs out to do Montana's find and treat strategy more rapidly.
Well, they are profoundly different questions. I think it's fair to say that female genital mutilation, to the extent that some of the equipment could be a carrier of infection, could be a worry. But in truth, female genital mutilation is much more an expression of the struggle for gender equality and of the transparent inequality which prevails not just in Africa, but in so many countries of the world. And I don't see female genital mutilation as much ingrained around HIV as I do as an expression of gender inequality, as so many things are an expression of gender inequality. Around the pharmaceutical industry, it's so very interesting because, of course, the generic drugs from India are what broke the impasse around treatment. And the fact that Cipla in particular, and Ramboxi and a couple of others, provided the drugs at very, very low cost. 80 to 90% of the people in treatment in Africa now are being treated by generic drugs. I think that's roughly right, Andre. And that's a most extraordinary breakthrough. Bill Clinton had a lot to do with negotiating the drug prices down. We're still struggling over patent. We're still struggling over WTO TRIPS provisions around patents. But on the other hand, through compulsory licensing, through the use of TRIPS flexibilities, through the constant pressure on the drug companies, I think we're gradually breaking through. We've even begun, I shouldn't say we, I've observed this, but there are a number of groups who are working with major universities in the United States, the most recent being Johns Hopkins, to get them to agree that the drugs they are producing will be available at cost to those for whom they are intended, rather than giving a patent out to a shared pharmaceutical company. So there is a lot happening on that front. I'm not nearly so cynical and unhappy about it as a number of years ago.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to pass this on, Stephen. This is not so much a question, but a suggestion. Someone on Twitter is suggesting that instead of using the term violence against women, can you use the term male violence? So I leave that to you as a suggestion from one of our
I will
listeners.
sleep on it.
Okay. And an interesting question here. Someone's asking if you have 5 minutes with Stephen Harper to change his mind on this, what do you say?
I wouldn't spend 5 minutes with Stephen Harper. Life is too short.
Thank you, Louis. I'm Shiraz, and I do research on what grandparents and grandchildren learn about health and nutrition. I consider Tommy Douglas as Martin Luther King of Canada, and I consider you as a global Martin Luther King, or the Martin Luther King of the world. I think it's an honor to listen to you. My question is about issue of gender justice. I don't think you use the term gender justice or gender.
Good term.
Yes, I was wondering when the audience asks what we can do. I tell my students work for gender justice, and I've created alphabet A to Z, which I gave you earlier. That there are so many issues which students, even watching a soccer game, they can ask CBC to show women playing soccer. At least it brings the issue of women equality playing soccer. But the other question is, I was wondering whether you would support celebrating Canadian Grandparents' Day on Tommy Douglas' birthday, and whether we should have Grandparents Film Festival, which run by your organization.
I'm not sure I caught it all, but I heard Tommy Douglas
Yes.
and my organization, and therefore I'm with you.
He was asking if we should have a Tommy Douglas Day as a national holiday.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. After all, he has been chosen as the premier Canadian hero. So why not?
There was a question about pharma that came from the audience, and there's a number on Twitter. But someone asked, just more generally, AIDS has a really big financial, economic impact. What's the role of business? You didn't talk about what should business be doing about this?
Throughout most of the countries, not just Africa, there have been continuous efforts made to create business coalitions to work on AIDS in conjunction with national AIDS councils. And very often on national AIDS councils in countries, there are business representatives. And very often the effort is to make the workplace an AIDS sympathetic workplace, to understand what the workers are dealing with. The big company which has made very considerable strides in this realm is Anglo-American in South Africa, who has a remarkable vice president in charge of the medical regime at Anglo-American, a fellow named Brian Brink, who persuaded the company early on, it's a very, very large company, thousands of employees, persuaded the company early on that they should treat those who were infected, that anybody who was HIV positive should be treated, and then he persuaded the company that they should treat the family if the family needed it, and then he persuaded the company that they should treat the community. And so Anglo-American has quite an outreach, and it's become a model for a number of companies in Africa and the way they should treat their own employees. And the International Labour Organization has an excellent handbook on AIDS in the workplace in which they deal with these issues very, very fully and intelligently. So there's a constant effort made, Andre, I think, to get business involved. Sometimes it's a little ephemeral and not very substantial. But that's usually when they're meeting in January in, where are they meeting in January? In Lausanne. What am I thinking of?
Yeah, the World Economic Forum.
The World Economic Forum. So when you get a bunch of corporate buccaneers at the World Economic Forum coming together, don't tell them I use that faintly pejorative term, I have a feeling that it isn't as persuasive, but again, in country, on the ground, it can be very effective.
It's already here on Twitter, Corporate Buccaneers.
It's already there?
Go ahead.
Just say Andre Picard used that in a somewhat irresponsible fashion.
See, on Twitter, you get a whole new name. I'm Picard on Health, so I get a whole new name.
I see. Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Picard on Health. So I'll start like a good Canadian with some thank yous. I'm a former Global Fund employee, and there's a lot of Canadians, and I know that we had a lot of moments feeling very proud because of the policy and the advocacy brought forward by Canadians. So thanks to you and to those in the room who gave us those humble moments in board meetings and rooms. And the second thank you is for raising the financing gap, which is very real. We know that governments do want to put money forward, but with changing governments or with economic crises, they change over time, and that will continue. We do have a gap to fill. What do you suggest is the best way we fill that gap? And have you seen any very innovative or market-based solutions that you think can work to help us get there in a more sustainable way?
But you see, I mean, I like the Global Fund, and I correspond with Sven Robinson as often as possible, so I keep in touch with the Global Fund. I don't believe in those bloody solutions. I think it's a complete cop-out. I think people have been mesmerized into taking governments off the hook by trying to find all of these other fundraising vehicles so that governments no longer have to pay what they should pay. And so whether it's a tax or a tithe on airline tickets, or whether it's a Robin Hood tax on international financial transactions, all of these things, which ostensibly raise money, although as I sit here, when we raise the money, it won't go to HIV and AIDS and the Global Fund. It'll go to reducing deficits of the countries that have raised the money. That's what it will eventually turn into. But what has happened, and what I think is unbelievably irresponsible, is the way in which the Global Fund leadership in the present incarnation is allowing governments off the hook. Instead of going after them, hammer and tong, when they have a deficit of $3 billion, they announce this is the greatest fundraising campaign in the history of the Global Fund. Complete BS, top to bottom. They lost a lot of money, and everyone knows it, and they didn't have the courage or the gumption to say it. Now, I admit that this is, it's the way I feel sometimes about those organizations in our local society who raise money because the provincial or federal governments won't provide the dollars. But my feeling has always been, and this is a personal feeling, I absolutely admit, and it's entirely possible that you're completely right and I'm completely wrong. It won't be the first time.
Unlikely.
But I genuinely believe that we have let the governments off the hook. We have not gone after Germany, we've not gone after France, we've not gone after Japan, we have not nailed them publicly, we haven't shamed them, we haven't said the death that they're causing by reducing, look at what Italy has done, look at what Holland has done. It's absolutely reckless in their willingness to find human beings disposable because they won't make their contribution. So for me, I would go after those beggars no hold barred. I would not spend my time trying to construct a number of other financial mechanisms.
Fair enough.
Okay?
Thank you.
I think I answered.
So I have time for one more question from the floor, and then I'm going to have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Yes, good evening. My name is Elizabeth Bowes, and I'm a member of the Burnaby Go-Go's, the grandmother group in,
My God,
in
it's
Burnaby.
everywhere.
We are everywhere. I was interested that you spoke about the film, and we're looking forward to it very much. And I just wanted to since there were questions, let everybody know that your daughter, Alana Lewis-Landsberg, will be here on November the 22nd in Robson Square, premiering the film here in the Vancouver area at a Greater Vancouver Go-Go event.
November 22nd? I
yes.
ask because I got to tell my wife when we'll be
Yes.
babysitting for
Yes, absolutely.
with the kids.
Yes, at Robson Square, and everybody is welcome. We'd love to see you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You know, Andre, I wanted to mention to everyone that the measure for treatment up until now has been something called the CD4 count. And without going into details of exactly what it measures, when it reaches a certain level, it started at 200 and then 350 and now 500. When it reaches a certain level, then people below that level are eligible for treatment. And what is happening, and I don't think this is reversible, and I personally think it's a good thing, is that very soon CD4 counts will disappear entirely. And it will be taken as holy writ that the moment you are found to be HIV positive, you should start treatment regardless your CD4 counts, so that initiation of treatment begins right away. And instead of a CD4 count, they will use viral loads, which are better able to track the actual illness or disease as it evolves. And more we're finding viral load machines, equipment, which can be made available at community level. But what it does mean is that the effort to put the additional 22 or 23 million people into treatment will assume a considerable momentum over the next number of years. And it's going to require an awful lot of money. I mean, these drugs, for a lifetime, that's not an inexpensive undertaking, no matter how cheap the drugs may be. And there are second-line drugs, and third-line drugs, and fourth-line drugs, and they're more and more expensive. And there are a number of opportunistic infections, and there are stockouts, and there are weak health infrastructures. One of the reasons that I think it's hard to assume that we can make it through 2030 with the end of AIDS is because all of these factors intervene. I was at a conference in Cape Town last December on treatment as prevention, which was chaired by the first head of the Global Fund, a fellow named Richard Feacham. And it was a fascinating conference because a number of the clinicians on the ground who came to the conference from around Africa were talking feelingly about the quality of care, that it wasn't simply getting the drugs into people, but it was the cascade of care to which they were then subject. Were they being looked after compassionately, decently, effectively? There are so many factors involved, and that's why this remains a tremendously important issue around which all of us should continue to be galvanized.
So I want to end the evening, Stephen, by returning to your theme. You expressed a lot of skepticism about the plan to end AIDS by 2030 with the current approach. So I want to leave the evening by asking you, referring to your great book, Race Against Time, are we still in a race against time, and when is AIDS going to end?
Yes, I do think we're in a race against time because there are still significant numbers of people, much reduced in number. I don't want to pretend that we haven't made significant progress. We have. But there are still significant numbers of people who are getting infected, are struggling with the virus, are getting treated late, are fighting to stay alive. There's still a lot of need for palliative and hospice care. There's still a lot of need for home-based care. There's still a lot of orphans and a lot of grandmothers trying to keep societies going. This is a constant struggle on the ground. You hear heartbreaking stories so often of a 10-year-old girl or a 12-year-old girl or a 3-year-old boy or a wonderful mother of 4 or 5 who ultimately succumbs. And it is a race against time for each of those individuals, and I refuse to diminish the race because the numbers are smaller. For me, the numbers don't matter as much as the principle of keeping people alive and attending to them. When will the end of AIDS come? It will come when the consequences for the society as a whole, in social and human terms, are measured as strongly as getting the drugs into people, so that we have both the commodities on the one hand and the human dimension on the other. And I think, Andre, that is at least a full 2 generations away. I think it's a long road. We still have more than 2 million people infected in 2013. If they are going to be on a lifetime of drugs, then it's going to continue, HIV at least, for a couple of generations. We'll beat this thing. I mean, it's hard to believe there have been 75 million infections. This is like the Black Death of the 13th century. It's unbelievable. But we'll get there. But we shouldn't be premature in our assumptions, because it's as though we tailor our assumptions to the donors. If we promise you it's over, will you give us the money? It does not work that way.
And I think in 2 generations, we'll still be remembering your contributions because you've done so much. So please join me in thanking Stephen Lewis for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.